On today's episode of the show, we discuss the wild turn of events, Coleman Hawkins canceling his visit to Louisville. We'll answer whether or not the Cardinals are finished adding to the 2024-25 roster coming up on this episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Happy Monday. Welcome into another episode of the Locked On the Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. And as always, I want to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is available free on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. In a wild turn of events, Illinois transfer Coleman Hawkins canceled his official visit to Louisville right before the weekend. And now fans are wondering, well, what is next? Will the Cardinals add another player? Personally, I think it is unlikely unless one of these three scenarios happens. We'll discuss what those three are coming up shortly. We'll also talk about Jeff Brom and company continuing to add more players in the 2025 class, 2 new football commitments, and then to conclude the show, we will dive into a signature Monday mailbag segment of the show. A lot of people were excited when the news surfaced that one of the top transfer portal power forwards, Coleman Hawkins, would be taking an official visit to Louisville over the weekend. Unfortunately, that never happened. Hawkins would announce, or it would be announced, that Hawkins is canceling his visit. Shout out to Ty Spalding of Rivals.com, Louisville Rivals, for that news. Hawkins wouldn't be making the visit. Fairly shortly after that, news surfaced that he was going to go to Kansas State, and now it seems like SMU and LSU both will get visits for the former Illinois standouts services. It's not ideal. And one thing that I made it very clear is that I'm not going to try to spin this into a positive. Coleman Hawkins would have helped this team. And I don't think he would have come off the bench. I think he would have been a starter. But make no mistake about it, just because he's not joining the team doesn't mean that Louisville is not going to see a high level of success. I still think that this is a tournament squad with a second weekend possible ceiling. Excuse me. And there's a ton of talent. The pieces on the team genuinely mesh together cohesively when you look at the skill sets, when you look at the impact on the court. I think that the sky is the limit for this year's Louisville squad in year one under Pat Kelsey. But the question is Louisville going to add another player? It seems that they've been entertaining that option of moving a player, moving one of the 2 medical redshirts to a walk-on spot and then bringing him on back to scholarship after this season. But we mentioned that the stars have to align. And, well, Coleman Hawkins was an option. He's no longer an option. The Cardinals reached out to Arizona decommit Jamari Phillips at the conclusion of not this past week, but the one before that. Since then, this weekend, he is headed to Oregon. So there aren't really any players that have been identified. And all truth spoken here, I think Louisville's probably done adding to the roster. I do, because the timing is not really the greatest. We're in almost mid-June. There aren't that many players out there anyway. If you're going to add a player, number one, you have to focus on not upsetting the current roster. You have to make sure that they fit what you need. And it just doesn't seem like there is a ton of opportunity for Louisville to add another player at the moment, unless one of three scenarios arises. I think the most likely of the three, because of the way things are seemingly trending, although we don't have any information, we'll see what this looks like for the week coming up. This is being recorded late on Sunday, so we don't know. If Dan Hurley happens to leave UConn, then there is a roster of very talented players that Louisville could go after. The team has 30 days to enter the portal. And, I mean, the Cardinals, we saw, if you are bringing Hawkins on a visit, chances are you have a good amount of NIL because you weren't going to be involved with Hawkins if you didn't. And even if Coleman didn't, even if the NIL asking price wasn't as much as perceived to be, he's not going to, he's not going to get a small amount of NIL. So Louisville would have to had a solid amount of NIL. So in that case, you would be one of the few teams in the country to have a solid NIL budget that potentially could offer a starting spot or could give you a depth role. So if Dan Hurley leaves, there are a handful of great players. Alex Caravan, Liam McNeely, Hassan Diarra. The list goes on. And I would probably take 8 to 9 players from that roster and put any of them on this Louisville roster. So that's the first scenario, is that if Dan Hurley leaves, it changes things because, you can add another difference maker. And could you imagine, now obviously all hypothetical here, but Louisville with Alex Caravan on this roster, I'm just going to shake my head. That would be incredible. But, I mean, it's all hypothetical in this sense. That's why I'm saying that it's unlikely unless one of these three situations arises. The first one is that UConn loses their head coach to the Los Angeles Lakers, and you have a mass exodus of players. Now, what UConn probably would do is hire internally and try to mitigate some of that roster loss and maybe give him a season to see what he does. And then you reassess after the 2024-25 season. But nonetheless, that would be the first scenario. The second one would be a player to reclassify from the 2025 recruiting class. It is a very, very solid class. It's going to be a great draft class. There are some great players that, are in the mix. And I'm really interested to see if any of the 2025 guys would reclassify in terms of who Louisville has been involved with. They have offered Isaiah Harwell, who is a top 10 player. Jasper Johnson has been in the mix. Bryson Tiller should be required to come to Louisville by default. If you know, you know. Shout out to our very own Trap Soul, Bryson Tiller. I think that's pretty hilarious that there's a player named Bryson Tiller. Nate Ament from Virginia has also been offered, top 15 player. The list goes on. There's been multiple top 40 guys that Louisville has gone after. And if you feel as if you can get one to reclassify and play sporadic minutes year one, and then year two, he has a breakout season because he spent the first one in the college ranks, then that makes a ton of sense here. But I think that it's likely probably 2A, 2B of what's probably not going to happen. Again, don't take this as, this is what is going to happen. Could and would are two very different entities. So I don't think it's likely. Stars have to align. But, hey, stranger things have happened. This is about the time to where you could see a top player reclassify. The third option, and this is sort of uncharted territory for Louisville, at least since I've been alive, 1998, and since I've been following Cardinal basketball. There's been a couple of international guys that have come to Louisville, but this late in the game on June 10th, to get an international player that basically at this point would be an unknown player. I don't think Johan Traore is going to play a single minute in America until he goes to the NBA. The third option would be to get an international player to be a late addition to this team. Now, Pat Kelsey has shown that he can definitely bring in international players and have them compete for minutes and play a solid role for his teams. But at this point, it seems like time is of the essence. Also, you have to work out, I don't know how that happens in terms of like visas to the United States or getting things to happen academically. We've seen players, like Big Z at Kentucky, some other players, Ty Wynyard at Kentucky, Enes Kanter couldn't even play. I keep bringing up Kentucky, but there are other international players that have had some issues being cleared by the NCAA, and we've seen that when you put things into the NCAA's hands, logic usually doesn't follow. So these are the three things here for me. Three scenarios: UConn if Dan Hurley left, a possible reclassification, and an international prospect. Those are the only three ways in which the Cardinals will add another player, in my opinion. So it's something that we're going to closely monitor. And if Louisville feels the need to add somebody, great. If they don't, that's okay as well. We're going to pivot for the moment. Two more football commitments to talk about. Antonio Harris from the 502, Jaylin Brown from the Sunshine State. Two trends that Jeff Brom is seemingly doing everything he can to continue. We will break down what both players will bring to the Cardinals program here coming up after we tell you about our friends over at LinkedIn. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs isn't just another job board. It helps you hire the professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're in the wrong place. 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire a professional like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Cardinal fans, if you're continually watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting, look no further. Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. You remember how I told you about how it seems that Jeff Brom and company are getting a little jealous that all the attention is on the men's basketball team with all the good news? Obviously joking there, but it makes it even more hilarious that Brom will say, okay, 2 commitments wasn't enough for you? How about 2 more? 2 more players joining the Flybill 25 class. The class now has over 10 members in the group. The first one we're going to talk about is the most recent commitment. On Sunday, Antonio Harris from the 502 plays at my alma mater, Louisville Male High School. Shout out to the Bulldogs, a 2-sport athlete, both football and basketball. Those who tune into the show know that I announce for male basketball. This coming up will be my, 7th season? Gosh, man, time flies. 7th season announcing for the Bulldogs. Antonio Harris, this will be his 4th season in the program. What I can tell you about him as a basketball player is he's extremely quick, uber athletic, great defender due to his footwork and lateral quickness. And you watch the film on football, and it's clear that the skill sets sort of trickle over both ways. Two-way player for Chris Wolf's team, wide receiver and defensive back, recruited at Louisville probably to be a cornerback. 6 foot, 170 pounds. The offer sheet's not the greatest. A lot of local flavor, Indiana, Purdue, Kentucky. I do think that those offers will grow. I think he's going to have a great senior season. And I'm all for keeping local talent in the 502. This is a player that I anticipated would be a part of this program. And another thing to note is that he is related. I think it's either his dad or his uncle is former Louisville linebacker Nate Harris. So has the ties to the Cardinals program, has visited the team quite often. I mean, being from the city, I'm glad to keep him home, as I like to see a lot of other 502 recruits stay home as well. As a player, I think the potential is there. 6 foot, very, very athletic and quick, solid footwork, is able to go stride for stride with opposing receivers. Ability to win those 50-50 balls and being able to read opposing quarterbacks. I think that one of the main things I'm focused on, excuse me, I've got the hiccups, is something that you always worry about with Kentucky players, and that is how are they going to do with better competition. And I do think that the competition in Louisville and the teams that Mel plays are probably a little bit better than outside of the city or outside of some of the major cities in the state. So very excited to see what Antonio Harris is going to be able to bring to the Cardinals program. Love that Jeff Brom is keeping local talent home. Another trend that we talked about last week, that he's continuing to, emphasize is Sunshine State recruiting. They got another commitment from a player from the state of Florida, Jaylin Brown. What I will say, Antonio Harris is a 3-star player. I did forget to mention, I don't want to overlook that, 8th best player in the state of Kentucky. But back to Jaylin Brown, ranked just outside of the top 1,100, a running back from West Palm Beach, Florida, Cardinal Newman High School, ran for 900 yards and 8 touchdowns this past season. Also is a member of the track team, a sub 4.5 40, plays with a ton of quickness and speed. Reminds me of Maurice Turner coming out of high school. The hope is that Brown follows that same trajectory of being overlooked, but has the speed and agility to make guys miss. And it translates over to the Power 5, to where you see Maurice Turner in the line to have a very fruitful junior season in the Derby City. You hope that is the same case for Jaylin Brown. The 5'11", 187-pound running back has some interesting offers: Georgia Tech, Kentucky, Minnesota, NC State, Tulane, Boston College among the Power 5 offers that he has. But it just seems that the interest isn't there yet. You hope that this is a case of Florida players being overlooked and that he's able to rise up the rankings. Remember, I made it a point of emphasis to say, do not panic about recruiting ratings or rankings at this time, because it's still somewhat early. In the middle of the fall, we can revisit this conversation. But look, Caleb Mantelo, committed to Louisville, was unranked. Where is he now? Just inside of the top 800. So guys are going to be rising up the rankings, and I'm interested to see what it means for the players that are committed to Louisville. Something that I thought was pretty interesting, that if Keyjuan and Isaac stay, over half of the players in the Louisville running back room will have the last name Brown. Brown has the 10-yard carry. What are you talking about, Isaac? Are you talking about Keyjuan, or are you talking about Jaylin? I think that's just pretty neat and pretty funny. But Louisville is now, I think, 10 players into the football recruiting class, if I'm not mistaken. And I think for the most part, this class is pretty solid. I think you have some 4-star level guys. Right now, they are ranked just inside of the top 40. I think some of these players are going to rise, and I'm interested to see what this means, for some of their players. Because right now, I think the majority of their guys are inside of the top 900, but some players still, I believe, are going to rise even a little bit further. So 2 solid commitments, and Louisville's recruiting momentum continues. Interested to see if it's going to be a trend over the next couple of weeks. There's going to be some solid official visitors on campus in that time frame. So we will continue to keep an eye out for the football momentum trend. But to conclude the show, we will dive into a signature Monday mailbag of the Locked On Louisville podcast. You all had some great questions that I'm going to answer coming up here shortly after we talk about our friends over at FanDuel. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Sometimes summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more. And you can bet it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It was $150. Now it's $200. That's $200 that you can use to bet everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. Right now, I put in my bet for Kristaps Porzingis to be the Finals MVP. Even after a great Game 1 performance, I think the odds are very favorable, and I threw a little bit of money on it because I'm all about trying to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to the future bets. So go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. You can also see some of the great odds that they have in place. FanDuel remains America's #1 sportsbook. Thanks for tuning in to this Monday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Final episode of the show dedicated to the weekly mailbag. You all had some great questions that I definitely want to answer. Some interesting questions that you can tell it's the off season because some of them were like, oh, wow, okay, it's pretty interesting. Like here, the first one is, if Kentucky wins the College World Series, do you think that lights a fire under Dan McDonnell? Where do you come up with these questions? It's a great question because I do think that the answer is yes, and I truthfully, of all the trash that I've talked to Kentucky fans about their baseball program, I really, really hope that they do not win a College World Series before we do. Now, this is being recorded before the Kentucky-Oregon State Game 2 goes final, so by the time you're listening to this, they could either be in Omaha or on their way to Omaha, or they could be ready for that winner-take-all Game 3 in the Lexington Super Regional. But they can make it to Omaha. That is what it is. I just don't want them to win it all, obviously. So, yes, but I do think that would light a fire under Dan McDonnell. So, continuing on along, I've been having conversations with some friends, and a good amount of them are convinced that Louisville will have a failure of a season if they don't make it to the college football playoff. What do you think in regards to this conversation? That's a tough one. I don't think it's a failure because you could win 10 games and still be theoretically left out. Like the ACC, the perception has never been lower for this conference. We just saw a Florida State team go 13-0 and left out of the 4-team playoff. Now, it was 4 teams. But again, shows you the perception is not there. So you best believe that there's going to be a ton of mental gymnastics trying to get some SEC teams, some Big Ten teams, and maybe even some Big 12 teams in over the Cardinals or any ACC team that's right there. So Louisville has to handle business, but I'm not going to say that a 10-win season is a failure if you don't make the college football playoff. Now, if they start out the year 10-0, and they obviously the questions put me to sleep. No, I'm playing. Expectations change, like discussions change all the time. They're so fluid. I don't think that the conversation changes unless Louisville has a situation to where they start out 10-0 and they sort of dwindle in the last part and they miss the college football playoffs. But at this point, no, I'm not going to say that I feel comfortable saying that the season would be a failure overall. I think that you're creating some pretty unrealistic expectations to expect them to be in the playoff. So the next question is surrounding the men's basketball side of things. I did sort of discuss this in the first segment. What if you could choose a percentage as to how likely it is that Louisville adds another player with Coleman Hawkins and Jamari Phillips off the board? What would it be? I'd say probably about 30%. And that leaves the option or the opportunity for a player to be added. But I think that it highlights that it's fairly unlikely unless the stars align. So that's sort of what I feel comfortable with. I think I wouldn't go higher than 40, probably wouldn't go lower than 20. Because I do think that with Louisville showing interest in some players, that they're obviously of the mindset that they're going to add a player if the opportunity is right. So, not good odds, but not impossible either. So I'm going to go with 30%. I don't believe that Coleman Hawkins would have started over Kaysen Pryor. Maybe that is why he didn't commit. Not really a question, but I sort of see where you're going with this. I think that Hawkins would have started alongside Pryor, both of them in the front court. He didn't visit. So obviously he's not going to commit. I will say that for me, whether you believe that this was Louisville's call, which it seems like that's likely the case, that Louisville sort of made the call to not bring him in on a visit because they didn't want to affect the chemistry on the court. If that's the case, who could you argue with? At this point, it sort of just is what it is. But no, I don't think that he would have started over Pryor. I think he would have started with Pryor over Ruths and Waterman. With Louisville seemingly choosing loyalty to the current squad, do expectations rise for guys like Noah Waterman, Frank Anselem, and Kenai Roots? I mean, I think the expectations remain the same. Anselem is going to be a rotational, situational big man off the bench. Noah Waterman likely starts. If he doesn't, he's very quick off the bench. Kenai Roots, I think, is going to be a rotational guy that will play sporadically more minutes in certain games than others. But ultimately, I think that it's going to come down to number one, King. Oh, excuse me, I go. There you go. Questions making me yawn. I'm playing. I do appreciate you all for introducing some questions into the mailbag, but it depends on if players can stay healthy, how well guys are playing together, and etc. So, I mean, I don't think the expectations change. If you are one of those people that are mad that Louisville passed on Coleman Hawkins, then that might necessarily be the case. But for me, it's not. Final question. This is more so of one headed towards baseball. Man, I don't know the answer to this one. Does Dan McDonald get fired if he doesn't make the tournament next season? I don't know that Louisville has the money to fire Dan McDonald. That's the elephant in the room. I hope we're not having this conversation late next May or next June. But if he misses the tournament, that will have been 2021, 2023, 2024, 2025. That will be 4 years. 5 if you're counting COVID, which everybody missed it. Man, that's rough. I don't know what would need to change. That's a very interesting conversation, but I don't think he gets fired. But then again, I don't know. So let's hope it doesn't get to that point. That is going to wrap up this Monday edition of the show. Thank you to tuning in. Be sure to drop a like on this episode. Hit the subscribe button if you are feeling generous, if you haven't done so already. And stay tuned to the next episode. One will be coming out either on this evening or on Tuesday. So be sure to be on the lookout. Go Cards.